Angela, I have a question.
Okay.
Um, my granddaughter wants to have some herbs for her apartment in College Station,
Uh-huh.
and I was just wondering what kind of soil would be best because it's she's on third floor. I know the
Right.
Armageddon soil is the best, but um,
Well, yeah, Arbogate soil is very, very good. Just its profile, everything's designed to work together. But
mhm,
when you're wanting to garden indoors and you would prefer to have a lighter soil, ProMix has a version. It's ProMix BX. The letter B is in boy, X. It
mhm,
has mycorrhizal fungi in it that supports
okay,
root growth. And so growing indoors, we really, even providing lighting, we don't, it's not the same quality of light as we have outdoors. And so having that mycorrhizal package in the ProMix BX, it's a lighter soil because it is a peat-based soil, but having that mycorrhizal package in it really does help with indoor growth. And that's what I use as a seed starting mix as well. So
okay,
tell her, and I know that, she won't want to buy the big bales that are generally
yeah,
available at feed stores and all, but she can order it. Um, well, I'm sure there's nurseries where she can buy it too, but she can order it online in smaller bags. And that way
mhm,
she can just buy what she needs as she needs it.
okay. Then I can use
Okay.
it myself
All
at
right.
home.
Well, it's 9:30, and so let's go ahead and get started if everybody's ready. And as Carol mentioned, you will get a recording of this program, so that helps. You don't have to keep quite as many notes. So I want to start out by saying that when you look for some of these strategies online, the most common term that you're going to run into is succession planting. It's been around for a very long time. But one of the things that I have noticed is that garden writers and YouTubers, bloggers, they often use that term succession planting as a very broad term, and they will include in that more than one of the continuous planting strategies that we're going to talk about today. But not all of them are succession planting. So that's kind of, it's like the word Kleenex. It's kind of become the catch-all term, but it's not as accurate as it should be or can be. And so today we're going to break these strategies down and cover the overlaps and definitions, because there are some overlaps. Some of these strategies seem very similar, but there are nuanced differences. And if we go over those, then you're going to be able to choose the individual strategies and the combinations of strategies that fit your particular gardening style. And you can explore them, as time passes too, and see exactly which ones work for you and the ones that you'd like to employ. So we'll go over that pretty detailed. When we're talking about production and the idea of increasing production, the question often comes up of, can you feed a family on the size of a basic urban lot? And to be very honest with you, no, not even in the very best of worlds, although, every once in a while you'll see an article out there that makes that claim. But in an urban setting, we really can't produce our own meat. You can always, have a few chickens, perhaps, or maybe a few rabbits. You can, produce eggs for sure. Um, but we really can't produce, enough meat to support a family on an annual basis. Grains are problematic. Wheat is requires a lot of land. Rice requires specific um, conditions to grow. We can grow amaranth practically and at a rate that can be harvested in the home garden, but we're pretty limited as far as major grains are concerned. And then of course oils, whether or not you're using animal fats or you're using vegetable oils, those are generally not something we can produce in the home garden, at least not the classic home garden. And then, we have a very varied diet. The American culture has blended recipes and foods from many different countries around the world. We're used to being able to go to a good market and find quite a few imports and exotics, some of which can be grown here in limited basis. But we really can't say that of these four things that we can produce enough to provide all the food we need for our family. So some of them are impossible, some of them are just impractical, and others, or I would say most of these things, there's a definite imbalance in the cost and benefit, the cost of raising something, versus the benefit you get from that. So really what we're looking for is to be able to supplement and support our family's produce supply in the urban garden. And we can do a lot of that, and employing some of these strategies to increase our production, we can produce even more of that. So there are several different things that we can take, or several different ways we can take a look at this. We can decide that we want to produce all of our family's needs of a few favored varieties. So if there are some things that your family just loves, say you're, big salad eaters, can you produce all of the vegetables that you need to support those salads year round here? Yes, you can, especially since, as the year changes, as we go from warm to cool and cool back to warm, we can vary the, components of salads that we eat. Same thing with greens. There are types of greens that can be grown year round. So, if your goal is to say, okay, there's a few things that my family really likes, we're going to produce all of that that we need from that, and then we'll supplement from the grocery stores and farmers markets. We'll supplement our other things. Then the other aspect is that you can supplement a portion of your family's needs of multiple varieties. So you can say, okay, I can't produce all of my family's needs of any one item, but I can grow, a few radishes, a few heads of broccoli, a few heads of cabbage, things like that, to supplement your family's needs for those things. You can also support your family's food budget by applying strategies to increase your home production, which is the goal of this program today. And through all of that, everything that you can possibly grow helps you avoid the national recalls, which it seems like we come up with a recall every couple of months. Some food or some packaged item has been put on a recall list. And then the food contamination risks for sensitive varieties. And those sensitive varieties are things that we eat without processing, things like, leafy greens and, the lettuce varieties, things that are washed, of course, from the garden to the table, but not necessarily, processed in any way that would eliminate the food contamination. So our major goal is to maximize the production that we can get out of a garden with the space we have available, understanding that most of us have a blended landscape where we, have entertainment areas in the landscape, are maybe areas for pets or for children to play. We have mixed use landscapes. And so we want to maximize the production that we do have out of the space that we have available. The strategies that we're going to discuss today will include succession planting. In fact, we're going to focus a lot on succession planting because that's one of the main strategies. We're going to talk about interplanting, also called intercropping. We'll discuss spatial interaction of plants, cut and come again crops. And then we'll touch on the ideas of nurse cropping, cover cropping, and edible mulches. They're not the main focus of the program today, but those three strategies allow us to combine strategies in our garden and get even more out of it as the year passes. All of these strategies are just a smaller scale version of polyculture. The two most common forms of polyculture are food forests and, of course, permaculture. This is a smaller scale concept of polyculture, but these strategies can be defined that way for sure. So let's talk about succession planting. And it's really the idea of growing a crop, replenishing the soil, and then growing a subsequent crop behind that. It can be defined really as continuous planting. The simplest definition of succession planting is just one after the other. It can be the same crop planted at specific intervals during its season. Say for, a good example right now, this is one of our really good succession cropping seasons is our winter and spring garden, where, we don't need, 25 heads of broccoli to be planted at one time and come in at one time. We want, say, 3 or 4, plants of broccoli planted every 21 days, so that we have a constant supply from about October through April or so of the following year. It can also be your rotational crops planted in sequence, so that the crop that you're growing now will be followed by the next crop in rotation as we go through the year. So both of those can be succession planting strategies. I usually focus in my classes on the idea of the different ways that we observe what nature does and, copy nature as much as possible. Our gardens are more successful when we do that. In nature, young trees replace older trees in a forest. So when you're visiting any forest area, you'll see the larger, more mature trees. They drop their leaves and create a wonderful nursery for the young plants to grow where their seed falls. And so you'll see younger trees of all different sizes growing under the canopy of the mature trees, ready to replace them as those trees become older and either, die their natural death or are damaged, in some way. So nature does provide for a succession plan. Annual weed crops are also another example, even though, we hate the fact that they're so successful, but they really do build soil and protect soil. Soil does not like to be bare. We need to cover the soil at all times. Of course, we can use mulches, but living plants are the very best way for us to protect and build soil over time. A best practice for the family food garden that we can use is the succession planting. It allows for much better management of the garden and the kitchen. We can, as each year passes and you get better and better at the timing of succession planting, you can really get to a point that you're doing a lot of supplementation. You really are coordinating the seasons so that you have fresh seasonal vegetables and fruits available for the table all the time. Preservation, if you want to grow things to preserve either through canning or drying or freezing, that can be done as well. And by using succession planting, we can do it in smaller, more manageable batches, so that rather than having a huge processing day where you're worn out by the end of it and you're using, lots and lots of energy, to both your personal energy and energy in the kitchen, is this can be done in smaller batches, maybe as you prepare a meal in the evening. And so it takes a lot of the stress and heavy work out of it and turns it into something where it's a manageable daily chore. Could everything be succession planted? Well, not really, but we don't need to succession plant everything. Some plants provide food for the table for a period of time from one planting. Tomatoes would be an example of that, particularly the indeterminate types that will produce over a longer season in spring. And then if you can carry them over the summertime, they will reproduce again in the fall. We've got several, indeterminate tomato plants that are, still ripening tomatoes in my garden now, because we've had such a mild winter up to this point. So from one planting, we really don't need to succession plant tomatoes. Now, if you are growing determinate tomato types, the ones that will grow and then harvest a crop over about a short 2-week period of time, we can really call it succession planting, because we're going to plant a spring planting of the determinate tomatoes, and then we would have a fall succession as well. So we would have 2 plantings of tomatoes throughout the year. Peppers are one that can be planted and then provide food for the table. Very, very muchly all of our, warm months, we would just, either lose our peppers in the first freeze, or sometimes, and it's becoming much more popular to do so, people are actually digging them up, cutting them back, potting them for over the winter, and then replanting them the following year. This works better with your hot peppers because they have a tendency to be more of a perennial type pepper than it does with your sweet and your bell peppers. They generally should be treated as an annual crop for sure. Okra is another one that you'll plant one time and have a full year's harvest off of those plants without having to succession plant them. Eggplants and cucumbers fall into that same category, particularly the vining cucumbers. Bush cucumbers are more of a determinate plant, and you might succession plant your bush cucumbers throughout the spring. Field peas and pole beans, those also are longer term crops. And then of course our fruit and citrus are as well. But for most of these, you don't really need a succession planting strategy, but you can at least employ a bit of one so that if, say, for instance, you get an early planting of these things out, say in February, late February, early March, and then we are hit by one of those occasional late season freezes in March or April, if you have a succession, a backup ready, then you can replace those plants if they are damaged or destroyed by a late freeze. So we can kind of look at that two different ways. Your storage crops, we don't need to succession plant storage crops because they can be grown once and stored over a longer period of time. So things like potatoes, onions, winter squash, pumpkins, and dried beans, we wouldn't necessarily need to plan those as part of our successions. We would plant those once and then expect some, several months of storage out of each one. So the things that we want to succession plant are the things that have a shorter window of peak freshness. And we choose to plant them in succession so that we can catch them at that peak freshness multiple times throughout the year. So many vegetables grow much more quickly. We have, things like radishes that grow quickly. There's a lot of variance in the maturity times of your leafy greens. So these are the things that we would be much more likely to succession plant. So the sweet corns, not necessarily the field corns, but the sweet corn can be succession planted. Lettuces, of which there are just dozens and dozens of varieties. Leafy greens, heading vegetables, things like your cauliflower and, broccoli, cabbages, things like that. Radishes, carrots, beets, and turnips can be succession planted. Some carrots and beets would have a little bit of longer storage time, but if you like to have them fresh for the table, I do recommend succession planting them. And then your edible potted peas and bush green beans, we can succession plant those as well so that we can have a more extended harvest of them at just absolutely their very best freshness. Some common succession intervals on 7-day intervals would be things like your baby lettuces or lettuces where you're going to harvest the outer leaves and allow the central core to continue growing. Lots of things like your baby greens, which are so good and tender and stay sweet in your salads. Radishes, which are a very quick, 21 to 40-day crop. Spinach, which also is one that can be grown either as harvesting the outside leaves or as a cut and come again crop. Cilantro, things like that can be planted on 7-day intervals. Your 10-day intervals would be things like your bunch lettuces or heading lettuces, Asian greens, sugar snaps, bush beans, and the super sweet corns. On 14-day intervals, things like beets, turnips, broccoli, collards, cauliflower, the green onions or scallions, arugula, basil, dill, and parsley. And then 21-day intervals are the things that have a little bit of a longer growing season, such as your carrots, your vining cucumbers, Swiss chard. Of course, Swiss chard can be grown for fresh cutting on your 21-day successions, but one planting of Swiss chard, it can perennialize for 2 or 3 years in your garden. It gets a little woody stem, which is fine because we're just harvesting the leaves anyway. Cabbages, Brussels sprouts, and kale, 21 days is good for those. And you can plant, you don't have to be locked into these intervals. These are just very common intervals, and since it generally works on a weekly basis, it's kind of an easy way to organize your garden as well. Oh, let me back up. This doesn't mean that these things are ready in that period. It's just that planted at these intervals, you can harvest them at intervals that allow them to be very at the peak of freshness for your table. Leafy greens, and there's so many of them. There really are two strategies for so many of your leafy greens. You can plant them with, if you're planting them from seed, you'll have 4 stages during the entire season. You'll have your newly seeded greens. You'll have young seedlings growing that are too small to harvest. You'll have harvestable young leaves that are generally harvested from the outside of the plant. And then harvestable mature leaves as they reach their peak of maturity in the garden. If you're growing them from transplants, you'll have 3 stages growing in your garden during the entire season. You'll have your newly set out transplants, whether you grow them yourself or whether you purchase them. You'll have harvestable young leaves and harvestable mature leaves. With this scheme, it's really best to grow your own transplants unless you have a local nursery that will have transplants available all season. One of the problems with buying transplants at the nursery is that quite often they will have 1 or 2 deliveries per season from the wholesale growers. And so if you say you were planting something that was on a 14-day rotation or 14-day succession, if you buy your transplants at the nursery and plant them, 14 days later, it could be the same crop that's actually still sitting in the nursery. And by that time, they'll be a little root bound and they won't be the same quality of plant. So, some nurseries do grow their own transplants. And so you'll have them, they grow them in succession as well. So you'll have fresh transplants available, but it is something that you need to really make sure that you work with a good local independently owned nursery to be able to have fresh transplants available during the season. One thing for certain with most of our nurseries, you'll at least get two of the successions out of them, because like right now, they started receiving their winter transplants in October and November, and then they will have another shipment of them in late winter. So you'll at least be able to get those 2 successions out of it if you're buying transplants. And then we have crop changeouts to deal with, which we will discuss more about those later on how to manage your soil for crop changeouts. But after the mature plants begin to wane, or they're getting to the end of their season and we're fixing to go into the next season of planting, the flavor and quality are going to decline. Many of them will start bolting. So then at that point, we'll clean their space out. We'll replenish the soil and fertilizer, and the space will be seeded again with the next vegetable that's in your crop rotation plan for the year. Planning your successions, there are several different strategies to this, and you do not necessarily need to group successions together. So in this image that you see in this planter box, we have 3 actual stages of carrots growing here. So we have the maturing crop, we have a relatively newly growing plot row here, and then we have the newly seeded carrots in this last row. But you don't have to necessarily dedicate these open spaces for your succession. If you plant in planter boxes or you have a large garden, you can allot a box for your first succession. And then your other successions might be, 25 feet away or so, someplace else in your garden. You may have one succession in the ground and another succession in a container. All of those work. It's just the amount of allotted space you have. You do not have to dedicate a cabbage bed or a mustard green bed, or a carrot bed. These can be spaced around your garden as well. That works very, very well for square foot gardeners for sure. just make sure that your garden plan reserves the space somewhere. And the good thing about it is on your shorter rotation plants, things like, radishes, beets, lots of your young leafy greens, lettuces, and things like that for sure. The great thing about those is that you can plant a short crop, like say plant radishes or beets or leaf lettuce in a space. And then if your rotation comes up, 60 days later, that crop is coming out before your next succession goes in. So you really do have a lot of flexibility. You don't have to leave empty space throughout the season. I do recommend that you always keep new plants on deck ready to go. That means propagating regularly. It becomes almost a habit to to be having something grow on a regular basis. Check your nursery stock often. Maybe just even mention to your nursery owner that you are planting in succession and that many people need to plant in succession. So maybe they can work with you to make sure that they have regular transplants available. And then keep seeds for many, many things that we would seed out. Keep the seeds for the next season on hand so that you don't lose time when you're ready to clear one crop out and plant another, that you have the seeds readily available at that time. So just buy them in groups. Keep in mind how long and how well they are stored, what their viability windows are, and just make sure you have a few packets of seed all the time. A very easy transplant strategy for succession planting is to buy a flat of vegetable transplants, and then at the same time pick up a sack of your seeding soil and seeds. Then when you get home, plant those purchased transplants, and then immediately, same day, go ahead and refill those nursery containers and replant them with the same vegetables that you want to follow along with. Your homegrown transplants will then be your next succession, because they're generally, plants, it depends on what you're growing, but they're generally ready, anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks afterwards. And you can just do that every time you plant. Just do that until, you pretty eventually wear those pots out. There are some clues on seed packets, and not all companies are really good at the information that they give on seed packets. Botanical Interest is one that really is very good. They have lots of clues. Sometimes they even have an extra flap that has a lot of good information on it. But this particular package has succession intervals listed here on this Mizuna mustard. Sow every 3 weeks and through early fall for continuous harvest, and in mild winter climates, which is like us, can be sown in late fall through winter for winter and early spring harvest. So some seed packets will actually give you that information of what your succession windows are. The other thing that can give you a clue is the thinning size. Like in this case, it says when 1 inch tall, thin to 1 every 10 inches. That kind of gives you a clue too, that when these plants are 1 inch tall, you can start your next succession, so that by the time they're mature, you would have your next seed to transplant interval ready to go. So sometimes clues can be found here. Other times you have to turn to the internet for some research on it. Thankfully, there are some of the seed companies now know that in mild winter areas, we do a lot of succession planting. And so places like Johnny Seed, they actually have a really good little section on their website about succession planting and the recommended intervals for different things. So we can find this information, and you'll, if you know your family's preferred vegetables and the things you like to grow, you can pretty quickly, in 1 or 2 seasons, you can develop your own list and your own schedule and calendar so that you can always have your transplants ready to go. Let's talk about intercropping. These words are interchangeable: interplanting or intercropping. And this is also one of, I would say, these are the top two methods of increasing production as far as strategies in your garden are concerned. And where succession planting is planting one after the other, intercropping is a simultaneous planting. And its goal is to have more than one crop sharing the same space. They can be alternate rows, which is what most commercial and market gardeners use. But more often for home gardeners, it's going to be a block intercropping of some kind. So we can say for our block spaces, wide row cropping, which a lot of us do now in our gardens, or square foot gardening, all of these are considered block strategies, and they're all really lend themselves towards the idea of intercropping or interplanting. So we can use the rows, we can use mixed intercropping, block intercropping, or relay intercropping. And each one of these is slightly different. So let's go over them so that you can decide which of these strategies works for you. As I said already, the row intercropping is most common in commercial operations, including market gardeners, where they are using these different varieties, but they're planting in rows so that they can keep things organized, and they may have different, successions going on at different times in this same plot. Mixed intercropping really lends itself to the home garden. And here we have several different types of leafy greens and even a heading green. They're sown into the same area in a block group. We have a little shard popping up here. And you can mix these seeds of the varieties and plant them all at the same time, even if they have a different harvest window. In fact, sometimes it works very, very well if they do have a different harvest window. Block intercropping is similar to mixed intercropping, except that it uses transplants. So your mixed intercropping is seeds, and your block intercropping would be things that you plant as transplants. Then relay intercropping is planting short interval plants into the spaces between longer interval plants at some point in their maturity. So in the case of this grouping right here, actually the marigolds were planted first, and then later the lettuce and leafy greens were, and the basils here were planted into them. Depending on how long the season is for some of your plants, you might plant a different relay crop into them more than once in a season. Say, for instance, if you did plant a longer term crop, like something like okra, and then you might do relay intercropping around those okra plants or pepper plants or tomato plants several different times while that plant is growing in the garden. So each one of those intercroppings is plants occupying the same space, just maybe not, just planting them at different times into that same space. Square foot gardening really easily accommodates intercropping because by nature, kind of by definition, they are an intercropping strategy. We save these blocks for certain plants. Some of them will take, one plant per block, things like broccoli or Brussels sprouts, heading cabbage, some of your larger lettuces, a tomato plant, a pepper plant would take one block, but its neighbor may have a completely different plant in it. Or you could even do things like I don't separate out my radishes. When I buy my radishes for the year, and I love radishes, so I keep them growing almost all the time, I dump all of the varieties into a Ziploc bag and just shake that up. And when I need a rotation in the garden of radish, I just mix whatever, it is and sprinkle that seed out, and what comes up is what gets harvested. So you can also do that with things like lettuces and some of your smaller leafy greens as well. But it's very, very easy to accomplish intercropping any one of those 4 varieties of intercropping in a square foot garden. The one thing you need to watch out for with intercropping is that the plants do need to be compatible, which means that their light and water requirements need to be similar. They don't have to be exactly the same, but they do need to be similar, especially when it comes to timing. And then the pH ranges also, need to be the same so that everybody has the same opportunity to absorb nutrients from the soil. So just keep that part in mind. Spatial interaction is kind of an odd way to describe it, but it's basically different perennial plants that are sharing the same space. So our intercropping and interplanting focuses more on annual things, and most of our vegetables and some of our herbs are going to be in that annual category, and we would use intercropping for those. But spatial interaction is basically intercropping for perennials. So different perennial plants will share the same space over a period of time. Guilds are a form of spatial interaction. And for those of you who are, not familiar with guilds, it's basically a group of plants designed to benefit each other. They're not selected for aesthetics. They're selected for, what do they do for each other? And guilds can be used in fruits, your longer term vegetables, and then your different specimen ornamentals. You can also design guilds around those. Herb gardens can definitely be included in the ornamental garden. So an herb garden would also be considered an interactive or spatially designed garden. Food forests and permaculture gardens are very good examples of spatial interaction. They're done on a very permanent basis with a very intentional design, but that's exactly what they are, is a spatially interactive garden. This is an example of a fruit tree guild, where the fruit tree is the center plant, but the plants around it are selected to perform a specific function. So you have what's called dynamic accumulators. Those basically are removing toxins from the soil. Pest deterrents, plants that would repel, whatever the target pest is of that plant, mostly through aromatics, meaning the oils in the plant themselves. Food plants that you can plant around them. You can very definitely use the space at the base of your fruit trees to plant additional food crops. A very highly beneficial way to do this and increase your production strategy is to plant your fruit trees, which are basically a permanent installation. And then in the summertime, plant melons and gourds and things like that around them. They produce a lot of leaf surface quickly, so they shade the soil, they suppress weeds, and yet they do produce a crop for you. And they can be allowed to just run at the base of your fruit trees, whereas sometimes those plants are so large that they really are hard to work into the rest of your vegetable garden. So utilize that space under your fruit trees to increase your production. Mulches and ground covers, particularly edible mulches and ground covers, those work well. Nitrogen fixers, things that are in your legume family, can be grown underneath those. For instance, right now, this time of year, fava beans or broad beans are a good plant. They're far more cold tolerant than most legumes, and they can be planted under your fruit trees right now. They do a lot of good things. One, of course, they'll produce food for you, but they also produce a lot of vegetative matter because they're a larger plant than some of our other legumes. You can, harvest the beans from them, and then you can chop and drop the vegetative matter, which feeds the soil on a continual basis. And then, pollinator and insectary plants can be planted in this guild. So a well-designed guild, and the guilds can change. You can have some permanent plants in there or some perennial plants in your guild, things like your herb plants, and then you can seed or transplant annual plants around them. So your guild can be something that you design and cultivate all year long, and it gets to be a lot of fun, and you'll find an awful lot of benefit to your fruit tree as well. The general health of your garden will improve, and you'll be building soil on a continual basis as well. And here is a tomato guild where the tomato is the anchor plant. And the good thing about them is that they also, because of aromatic oils in them, they have a tendency to repel certain pests. But onions are a good companion for them. The sunflowers can be arugula, just different things that you can plant in a guild around a tomato plant, increase your production and benefit the tomato at the same time. One of the very best to plant around them are the basil family, because basil has a root exudate called rosmarinic acid. Quite often you'll just see it listed as RA. And it suppresses the microbes, the pathogenic microbes that can cause crown rot of tomato plants. So that's a very good thing to do. And then the marigolds, especially the French and African, the old-fashioned marigolds, will repel the root knot nematodes that can attack tomatoes. So tomato guilds, and that's something that we're exploring more and more as time passes. Your next production strategy are to plant cut and come again crops. These are plants like in the case of these lettuces, there's always more than one strategy. With things like spinaches and lettuces and some of your leafy greens, you can grow them and harvest the outside leaves and allow the central leaves to mature, or you can actually cut them off an inch or so above the root, and then they will resprout and regrow a second crop. One of the good things about a cut and come again strategy is that it slows bolting. The issue with bolting is people think it has to do with the age of the plant, or that it always has to do with warm weather. And so we're having, this kind of unusually warm winter, and people are having trouble with plants bolting already. But bolting is a little bit more complex than that. Actually, bolting is usually triggered when there is a cool period, particularly cool evenings, and then warm days. That can trigger bolting. Or we can have an early, cold, almost a light frost, and things, we have new transplants in the garden, and then if it warms up after that, instead of staying cool, that will trigger bolting. So generally bolting is triggered by a warming period immediately following a cool dip. But cut and come again allows for a harvestable crop after insect or weather damage as well. So if you're growing something, like your kales or other leafy greens that you plan to cut and come again, if we do have a hard freeze, or you do have a, insect, let's say, whitefly damage, or on some of your cruciferous plants, the cabbage butterflies come in and, really damage a crop, because they can regrow after being cut back, you can go ahead and cut them back, the damaged plants, and they will regrow. So you don't lose your entire, crop or investment of time. So cut and come again crops are a good way to keep your production up at a good basis. Believe it or not, there's a lot of cut and come again plants. In the case of the green onions, that would be a pull and grow again, is particularly your multiplier type onions. But this list of plants are things that can be grown and cut on a regular basis and then expect to grow again. And some of them, like if you harvest radish greens, or in this case, turnip greens, these would be things where you're not really growing them for the root crop. You're just growing them to produce the leafy greens on top. And you may cut and come again maybe 2 or 3 times or more during a season. And then sometimes at that point, the root crop portion of it will have become woody, but other times, and with certain varieties, it may be harvestable. If nothing else, they are improving your soil, because they're growing in the soil, breaking it up, sending their roots down into the soil, and creating channels for both water and for microbes. So with every one of these cut and come again crops, you're gaining something. Green onions, you can actually cut the green tops and leave the root in the ground, and use those green tops in the garden, and they will regrow. They're a little bit slower than, say, things like your lettuces and mustard greens, but they do qualify as a cut and come again crop. Nurse cropping is something that we included in our production strategies because they can help protect another crop thereby increasing its production. So it's basically using a compatible companion to provide support to the vulnerable species. And this doesn't mean support like climbing. Like in this case, because of the way we grow sweet corn and as quickly as they grow, we really are not planting that with the idea of allowing something like beans to climb them. When I say provide support, I mean support in a way of like nursing. So we would do something here like provide a little bit of shading. So say you're going to plant a late planting of winter vegetables that are a little bit, more tolerant of shading and a little bit less tolerant of heat coming up. If you have a nurse crop planted on the sunny side, the south and western sides of that, it'll provide some shading and extend your harvest season a little bit. We can also provide windbreaks. So those of you who may live in a more coastal area, you can use a nurse plant, something that's taller and tougher, as a windbreak to protect smaller and more vulnerable, more tender plants on the windward side of them. Really, nurse cropping can be used in any type of gardening, whether it's your production vegetables or your ornamentals. And there are a couple of strategies with nurse cropping, things like fruit trees. When we graft onto, or what we call top work, a mature fruit tree, I have reworked the tops of several citrus where during one of our freezes the last few years, people have lost their the variety and they now have rootstock growing, but that rootstock grows very vigorously. And so we will cut and graft onto several of the branches of the rootstock, but we'll leave the branch that's the largest branch that's on the southwest side, and that will provide a little bit of shade to protect the young grafts. And then after they're established, then we'll go ahead and take out that southwest branch of the citrus. So all of these are things where we're using a plant to nurse or protect another plant. And this does increase production by using protection as well as very efficient use of the space. The nurse crop can also be something that's a harvestable crop as well. And then you get a double benefit out of it. Cover cropping is a production strategy if we use things that are living mulches. In this case, this is quite often now being done even on a commercial basis, and not just on 5 or 10 acre farms, but some of them that are hundreds of acres. We use an edible plant so that we get an additional harvest. They provide weed suppression. They provide a habitat for beneficials. They're definitely soil building if we choose things that are nitrogen fixing plants or nitrogen protecting plants. They give us a lot of carbon capture and sequester carbon in the soil. It prevents crusting of the soil so that we don't have as much soil loss, either to wind or water. So cover cropping, it can be used for several different strategies in the home garden. But definitely, if we do cover cropping with edible plants, we are increasing production and really benefiting the garden from multiple ways as well. Edible mulches are more than food production, but they can definitely be food production. Here, this is an ornamental garden that has iris and trees in it, but they use the strawberries as a mulch, as a living mulch. So they're getting the weed suppression because the strawberries are densely planted, reduces erosion and prevents crusting. It also helps keep the soil cool, which is another good strategy. And yet, you're getting something edible out of what would otherwise be a strictly ornamental garden, thereby increasing your opportunities for food production. Beyond planting, we've covered pretty much the planting strategies for increased production, but it can be more than that. If we use some efficient protocols, we can change our maintenance and cultivation practices as well that will increase our overall production. Some additional benefits of using these strategies is insect management. When we plant these very diverse gardens and we're mixing crops in them, we'll have some increased pollination. One of the things to know is that when it comes to pollination by bees, that bees only visit one type of plant per visit from, per trip from the hive. So, for example, you may see a butterfly drifting from one plant to another plant within your garden. But when a bee leaves the hive and she's headed for a peach tree, let's say, she's only going to take peach pollen back to the hive. They do segregate pollen in the cells that they store in the hive. But if that bee is leaving the hive and she's, collecting pollen from the peach tree, and she observes a plant, another plant blooming in your garden, the next trip out may be visiting that plant. So you do increase your opportunities for pollination. And then some of our pollinating insects, things like wasps and butterflies, native bees that are not colonized type bees, they will randomly visit different plants around your garden. And the more that's blooming, the more they're attracted to your garden. Sometimes we can interplant these things and repel pest species, particularly in that guild approach to planting, where one plant has a repellent quality to protect other plants. Definitely, when we do this type of planting, we provide habitat for the beneficials. The idea of the mixed types of seeding, where we're integrating things through intercropping, that provides some camouflage. Insects are very opportunistic. And so when they fly over a garden and there's a huge planting, say, of cabbage, the cabbage moths will come in and exploit that. But if you have that single head of cabbage or two or three heads of cabbage, and they're mixed in with other plants, other vegetables, maybe planted around a fruit tree, if they're mixed into your ornamental garden, they're camouflaged, and so you won't have as much insect predation as you do in a standard garden. Then there's the idea of trap cropping, where you're planting a plant within your intercropping strategies that will attract a pest so that they'll leave your preferred crops alone. Definitely with all these strategies, because we're planting in a more dense manner, we get the weed suppression benefit and the soil cooling benefit. In some cases, we're going to get enhanced flavor. For a long time, people swore that when they planted basil around their tomato plants, that the tomatoes had a deeper, richer flavor. And I think that for a long time that was considered an old wives' tale. But now that we understand more about root exudates, that plants actually send chemicals into the soil that are used by microbes and absorbed by the surrounding plants, we now know that they actually do contribute to the flavor profiles, enhancing flavors of the adjacent plants. Also, we can, increase productivity because of our denser planting. We have some symbiotic nutrient management because different plants have different nutrient requirements. Nitrogen fixation by mixing legumes into our mixes, and then increased diversity of soil microbes. One of the interesting things, the more we learn about root exudates, is the fact that the more diverse our plantings are, each plant puts out a different set of root exudates, and each different root exudate supports a different group of soil microbes. So every time we use one of these production strategies where we're utilizing multiple varieties of plants in a given area, we're increasing the diversity of our soil microbes, and therefore our soil health is improving at the same time. There is a theory of intercropping, a strategy that was used in Africa. They're utilizing it to protect cereal grain crops in very large plantings, and this is called the push-pull theory. And I think that this is something that, as gardeners, we can explore in our production strategies as well. There are 13 published studies. They're pretty easily available on the internet. they're a little bit of dry reading, but I did find them interesting. But they were done in Kenya and South Africa, and the strategy was that they planted their cereal crop. This is the crop that they intend to harvest. Then they planted push plants around them, which are plants that repel pests of that crop. And then they planted pull plants, which are trap crops designed to attract pests away from the crop. And they can also be designed in this push-pull theory to suppress weeds and attract beneficials. This is sort of a graphic of that push-pull theory for maize plantings, which was a cereal crop that they were trying to plant. So here are our maize plants here, which are what we intend to harvest. They plant pull crops on the outside edges to attract, the pest plants to lay their eggs here instead of on the maize. And then they have the push crops, which are, this graphic's a little incorrect. They're actually down here. There's desmodium, which has a volatile oil in it that actually repels the pests. And in this case, attracts some of the natural enemies. So using this interplanting strategy right here, intercropping strategy, they increased the growth and quality of the maize. And I think that we can start exploring some of this in our own gardens by using companion planting strategies along with our production strategies. It's kind of something that interests me that I'm kind of going to explore in the next couple of years. We also want to practice crop rotation. This is definitely a production strategy because it keeps our soil more our soil healthier and our gardens more productive by always planning to have the next plant in the succession. So you can succession crop, your broccoli all throughout the winter, but then when we get into where we know we're pending to have the warm season start, it's idea of planning, okay, what's my next rotation going to be after I, harvest all the broccoli and clean this bed out. And there are a great many rotation strategies out there. This really is the simplest one. It's just that idea of, leaf, fruit, root, legume in sequence. So that we always have something, something ready to go. And in all honesty, it doesn't have to specifically be each one of these, as long as you're planting a different category of plant following the next, you're really doing a crop rotation and your soil is getting healthier as time passes. In the Houston area, all of these strategies can be planted either by transplants or by seed. In our area, some plants grow better by transplant. We can also cheat the seasons by using transplants on a regular basis. It's always good to keep seed on hand because once you pull one crop out, it's very easy to just scatter a few seed in that area so that you don't lose production and you've got, one ready to follow the other. One of the things that I think increases production, and it's a common mistake we make as gardeners, is thinking that larger is always better. And in all honesty, for several reasons, we would be better off to plant younger, smaller transplants. Like in this case here with these lettuces. Once they have a couple of sets of true leaves, we don't have to wait until these plants are 4 to 6 inches tall to transplant them. In fact, quite often younger transplants have less transplant shock. And if you visit commercial operations, you'll see that they don't wait until things are as big as, this is a very common nursery transplant size right here, but they don't wait that long. They'll have 4 to 6 young leaves and they will plop those things right in the ground and get them off to a good start. There's a couple of reasons for this. The reason this helps us increase production is that having less transplant shock, they get their roots grown and start producing our food, the actual food plant, easier and faster. The reason that we need transplants this size in the nursery is because the very young transplants don't ship well. They need to be of a size that they're sturdy enough to take, shipping through a truck and then the unloading and handling that they're going to have in the nursery. But when we're growing our own transplants at home, they can actually be quite young when you're ready to transplant in. In fact, for some things, especially a lot of our leafy greens, if you reduce the leaf surface of the transplants before you put them in, it will help them establish their root system faster, and you'll end up with longer and healthier production. So in these young lettuce transplants right here, these are a 2-inch plug. Actually, you can hold them at the base, and I would cut these in half, just tear them, just hold the base. You don't have to do it with a pair of scissors. Just actually literally tear that little lettuce plant in half. And you think, gosh, that's just got to be so tough on them because they're so young. But really, if you'll transplant them like that, they will actually take off faster and produce longer, large leaves, healthier leaves, because you're reducing the leaf surface. It's the same principle as trimming things back when you transplant them. They'll spend their time getting that root system out there, and they get established very, very quickly that way. We need to pay attention to spacing, and one of the ways that we can increase our production is by using the 75% principle. So if you get a seed package and it tells you to plant them on 12-inch centers, reduce that to 9 inches, cut it by 25%. When they're young, they'll have enough space. When they're older, this is a good goal to have the seed leaves, the leaves of these plants touching or even slightly overcrossing. We're not looking at things like, roses or, pentas or something where you're trying to make sure that it has its mature space available to it in the garden all the time. We're talking about production plants, things that we're going to harvest. And we're more likely to harvest, things like your leafy plants and herbs and things like that at a younger stage before they actually get to full size. So we can crowd them by that 25% without losing production of any kind. In fact, you'll quite often increase production. And this works with both succession planting and with interplanting, both strategies. The one things we want to do when we're designing, especially these group plantings or the intercropping, is to avoid antagonists, meaning plants that actually have a negative effect on the plants around them. That also comes from those root exudates. And then we want to watch out for allelopaths. Those are things that actually put out a root exudate that can kill an adjacent plant or prevent seed from germinating. We want to do things like avoid planting the Solanaceae family anywhere adjacent to each other because they share disease issues. So we don't want to group or interplant tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and potatoes because they're all in that same family. Companion planting charts are good references. We did the companion planting class last month, which is why I chose to follow this class with that one, because the companion planting charts will help you avoid the antagonists, and it will identify the allelopaths as well. So I included those charts in this program as well. So when you get the recorded program, you can choose to print these out of it if you wish, because it does give the good companions are listed. So okay, I can mix all of these for my interplanting, intercropping strategies. I can use these for my spatial interaction in the herb garden or the ornamental garden. And then it identifies the enemies. So those are things that you would not want to plant together. So all 3 pages that include the local companion planting chart are included in this program. We do want to pay attention to managing our nutrient demands. So when we design our successions, if we design our intercropping, when we choose, companion plants that would be things like your edible mulches or your nurse crop, we want to make sure that they have the same or similar nutrient requirements. You can mix light feeders and medium feeders in the same area they don't harm each other. You might avoid planting more than one heavy feeder in the combination. So if you do, if it's a shorter interval crop and it's a heavy feeder, that's generally a good idea. It can also be a longer interval crop if it's fed with each, short interval rotation. But just pay attention to, whether it's a heavy feeder, a light feeder, when you design your combinations, and design them with that in mind. We do need to make sure that we maintain soil fertility, or at least the potential for soil fertility between crops. So what we'll do is we'll remove the old crop residue. When you have legumes planted, any legume, whether it's perennials, things like bluebonnets in a mixed garden for your spatial interaction, or whether it's, beans and peas in your vegetable garden, never pull those out. Always cut them at the soil surface and leave the roots in the soil, because the point of nitrogen fixation with legumes is that they actually collect the bacteria that fix nitrogen on their roots, and then the plant forms the little nodule around that. The plant itself forms the little nodule to protect those bacteria. So if we cut the legumes off and leave the roots in the soil, as they decay, they will release those nitrogen fixing bacteria into the soil. So our soil becomes its own nitrogen accumulator. So never pull the roots of legumes out. In all honesty, you can actually cut most of your plants back and leave the roots in the soil to decay. It's actually good for the soil, and it's a good soil building strategy. After removing the old crop residue, we would add fresh compost, additional fertilizer, and also a good handful of dried horticultural molasses. Dried horticultural molasses is something so you can get it at some garden centers, but generally you'll find this at feed stores because it's used in winter feeds. It supports microbes. The horticultural molasses feeds the microbes, the carbohydrates that they might be missing, from the plants that are growing. And so it just takes a handful per square foot. You really don't need to do any specific measuring. It's non-burning. It can't hurt anything. And the other good thing about horticultural molasses is that it does suppress nut grass. So if you use it on a regular basis, you'll see your nut grass decrease over time. It doesn't happen overnight because it's not an herbicide, but you'll see less and less and less of it as time passes. And then generally, most of our slow release organic fertilizers recommend a cup per square foot for pre-planting, but between crops, you can generally reduce that amount to a half a cup per square foot, because we're just replenishing what the plants have used. The exception to that would be for your long-term plants, things like your okra or peppers, and for things like your very heavy feeders, you might want to increase that a bit. Regular use of compost can reduce your fertilizer use over time. Again, this isn't something that you can accomplish in one season, but if you regularly replenish the compost in your garden, particularly if you're either making your own compost or buying high quality compost, you'll find that each batch is a little bit different and has a little bit different nutrient profile. So if you do that replenishing on, an annual or biannual basis, your soil will improve over time. It also corrects soil composition by making carbon available and increasing aeration as well. It's just a good thing to do on a very regular basis. The fertilizers that I recommend we use are all naturally release organic fertilizers. Slow release organic fertilizer is, an interchangeable word there. These are organic sources of major nutrients. They become available slowly. They don't do what's called nutrient dumping. It's very best, they take about 2 weeks for the soil microbes to break them down and make them available. So quite often when you're planting transplants and you're looking for high production, you can put the slow release fertilizer in the soil, but then after transplanting, you would want to water them in with a more water soluble form. In that case, I would recommend your liquid seaweed products can be used there. Things like soil menders, uh, foliar can be used as a drench. And Ocean Harvest is a very good product to use. So just water in with that, and then that'll give it a little bit of a boost until your soil microbes can start breaking down the natural release organic fertilizer. A great many of our local blends are very, very good, very high quality. They will have a rock mineral package in them. If they don't, you can use azomite to keep your mineral content up. And some of our local fertilizers actually have the dried molasses in them already, and you won't have to add that as a separate component. And then some of them also have a mycorrhizal fungi package as well, so that will keep your soil favoring those mycorrhizal fungi relationships with the roots of your plants. The easiest way to apply, as I mentioned already, is that, your commercial package will have the application rate and the recommended frequency. So read that first. But in general, a cup per square foot to establish a new bed, and that half a cup per square foot between crops works. Excuse me. It is best if they have soil contact, because it's the soil microbes that actually break these nutrients down and make them available. So if you have a mulch down, pull it back and mix this. You don't need to trowel it in particularly, just, a gloved hand. You can mix your fertilizer into the top few inches just with your fingers, as long as it has good soil contact so that the microbes can go to work. Foliar feeding is one of the best ways to deliver trace minerals. This does not deliver your bulk nutrients very well. Your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they'll absorb a little bit, but not much. Those need to be delivered basically through the soil. But the other things in foliar feeds, the other minerals, the trace minerals, they're absorbed very, very well through the leaves. It also stimulates the development of leaf microorganisms. We know a lot about the soil food web, but we're just learning about the leaf food web and the microorganisms that are the first line of defense against diseases on the leaves. There are several really good ones available. Again, we are so fortunate in the Houston area to have some local suppliers, that really have high quality products. So we can support local business, and they've done a really good job for us as well. Ocean Harvest, as I mentioned, works well. Garrett Juice, which comes out of the Dallas area. You can add Epsom salts to these at the same time. We can also add EM1, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. You can use pump sprayers if that works for you. A lot of us that would have a larger garden, or we definitely are blending food crops in among our ornamental plants as part of our production strategy. A hose-in sprayer is the fastest and most economical way to get our foliar feed out. When I mention Epsom salts, I just want to make sure everyone knows these are not a sodium-based salt. So when people say, well, I use, Epsom salt on my garden, people will panic. Well, I thought salt was bad for your garden. Sodium is bad for your garden. There are many chemicals that are, we call chemical salts. It's basically magnesium sulfate. It does not build up in the soil. It's non-burning. Epsom salt can contribute to seed germination, which is important in a vegetable garden for sure. Makes plants grow bushier. Definitely if what we're eating is the leaves of the plant, we like them to be bushier. That increases our production. Even on things like pepper plants to the fruiting plants, if they're bushier, they'll have more blooms and therefore we'll end up with higher production. It produces more flowers, and since flowers equal fruits, that's a good thing to keep in mind. It increases chlorophyll production, which can increase leaf production, and it can also increase the nutrient value of our plants, because chlorophyll is one of the building blocks of the nutrients in our plants. And it also improves the absorption of the macronutrients through the roots as well. When you're using Epsom salts for garden startup, when you're preparing a bed, a cup per 100 square feet just mixed into the soil before planting is a good strategy. The only plant that they have identified or studied that does not like Epsom salt is the sage family. So that would include your edible sages, your culinary sages, and your salvia plants. They're in the same. So steer clear of it where you're planting those, but it's good for your vegetable garden in general. And EM1 that I mentioned as one of the foliars, that is a probiotic for gardens. So it's a group of effective microbes. They're in the same family as probiotics that we use for human and animal health, several different lactobacillus type of microbes. It supports the leaf food web and combats pathogenic microbes. So it can be used as a foliar or a drench. And since EM1, which is this particular brand happens to be produced here in Texas, one of the things that gardeners have observed, and so the company actually did some research on, is that it seems to completely eliminate leaf blight, especially like tomato blight. And people are getting, I've noticed a big difference in health of leafy plants or the leaves of plants. And it can be beneficial in your ornamental garden as well as your vegetable garden. And these things are absolutely non-toxic. I mean, every microbe in this is a microbe that could be ingested by humans. And these companies also make liquid probiotics for human and animal consumption as well. So it's just a really good, microbial inoculant for the garden. It does a really good job. With that, I will close the program and open up for questions that you might have. My biggest recommendation is when you go through these different strategies is try to find the ones that are going to work the very best for you, so that you can use them in combination. And you may find that you use them throughout your garden. You might use them just in your vegetable garden for the time being, and then eventually branch out into the into the fruit garden, into your ornamental garden. You may find that you don't even think of them as separate gardens anymore, that you'll start doing things like, treating your entire ornamental garden as a potential for increased production by planting grocery type, vegetables and fruits out within that garden as well. Okay, so with that, do we have any chat questions? Oh, yes, we do. Let me
Yes,
open those
a lot.
up. Okay.
What varieties of carrots do you suggest? This from Sharon. I find that my carrots take so much longer than even the package suggests.
Yes, they really do. Okay, so a couple of keys on carrots is, one, we need to avoid the very long varieties, what I call the grocery store varieties. We want to plant the French style, the Nantes, the little short, the shorter carrots, up to maybe 6 inches or so. Good grief, I don't know what's causing that. Those are the ones that I would lean to. Carrots, I really the last few years have gotten into growing them in containers more than in my garden soil. And the reason for that is they like a combination of sand and compost. They seem to do the very best that way. They do take longer than the package suggests. They do need to have a consistently moist soil. uh, to me, that's just the very best way, is to keep them moist. I think that carrots actually do pretty well in a partial sun location rather than a full sun location. And then, winter planted carrots do much better than spring planted carrots. But sticking with those that are 6 inches and less works best for us. We just don't have the soil profile for them.
Okay, what type of barrier around the bed was used uh, in the picture with the carrot succession? But
That is a composite decking material. It's one of the composite woods that they recycle plastic bags and they mix it with a wood product. But that's what it's made of. But it could be done with any barrier.
Any recommendation source of seeds to buy?
Absolutely. Okay. So right now we're kind of focused on late winter and early spring garden. And so we are planting lots of leafy greens, Asian greens, and root crops, onions, things like that, which onions aren't technically a root crop, but we kind of include them in that category. So one of my favorites over time has been the Kitazawa Seed Company. They have recently been purchased by True Leaf Seed. The Kitazawa family is working with True Leaf. So I think that they're still, I won't say they're on staff, but they're still available. So I would say True Leaf is a good place. Botanical Interests, and thankfully most of our local nurseries carry botanical interest seeds there. So you can pick them up locally, not just on the internet. That's a good one. For tomatoes and peppers, I quite often use an online company called Reimer Seeds, Reimer. The reason for that is they were able to obtain the tomato seeds that were the work of one man back in the 20s and 30s that had been bred for Gulf State market use. In fact, there's a tomato called Gulf State Market. They were the only company that carried it for a while, and it's my favorite tomato as far as dependable heat tolerance is concerned. And it's a good sized tomato. It's not a huge slicer. It's a good medium sized tomato that's good for both slicing and for salad use. LSU recently got interested in Gulf State Market, and they actually have out now a Louisiana Gulf State Market seed that they developed. I've not tried it yet. This is the first year, but I have ordered it to plant for this year. So that's a favorite of mine, is Reimer seed. And then of course we have Baker Creek, Johnny's Seed. Believe it or not, even though Johnny's is a huge seed company, they were the very first ones to sign on to the Safe Seed Pledge. So you know that a lot of their seed is grown organically. They don't carry GMO seed. There's very little GMO seed out there in the first place. There's a lot of misconception and myth around that. But they did sign the Safe Seed Pledge. So those are all good companies. Renee's Garden. Renee is a wonderful woman. She trials absolutely every seed that she grows. So if she offers it, she has trialed it in her gardens. And she also uses a lot of small seed growers. So she has a good model, as far as her integrity is concerned. But those are some of my favorite seed companies.
Okay, how would you cut and come again cabbage?
Well, cut and come again cabbage is a little strange. And let's talk about broccoli and cabbage at the same time. So we know that these are heading vegetables. But when you harvest your initial head on broccoli and cabbage, if you will cut it as high as you can, not cut it at ground level, but leave the basal seeds, they will both produce side shoots. So your cabbages are your second growth of cabbages, and you'll have 3 or 4. If you cut it just right and you're lucky and the weather is good, it'll produce 4 smaller cabbage heads. They're going to be about the size of a turnip. They don't produce another full-size cabbage head, but they're very tender and very delicious. And if you have the space and the time available, you can allow those to develop. The same thing with broccoli. If you'll cut just below the head, that will resprout 3 or 4 smaller heads of broccoli as well. So that's how cabbage is used as a cut and come again.
Okay. What is the purpose of the sunken mulched bed around tomatoes in the guild?
Yeah, if you go back and look at that graphic, you'll see it's not actually sunken. What that is you dig a ring around the tomato plant and pack that with, your high quality leaf mold compost, or there is a compost available from the Arbor Gate that is a 50-50 of bacterial and fungal compost, which is a really good blend. So that's basically a ring or a sink of very high quality compost planted around the tomato plant. That's what that little sunken area is. It's filled with compost. And the second question was, is the sunflower? Yes, that is absolutely used as a trap for stink bugs. Now, sunflower you have to be careful with, because some members of the sunflower family are allelopathic, meaning that they will suppress growth or suppress seed germination. So you can use them around tomatoes, but you wouldn't want to necessarily use them around everything else. But they are a magnet for stink bugs. So if you have a lot of trouble with them, you can definitely plant them close to things like tomatoes and green beans that are very susceptible to the leaf-footed bugs, and pull them away and deal with them on the sunflower plant.
Okay, then we have a novice question. What's living mulch?
Well, mulches that we generally put down are things like, native mulch or pine straw or fallen leaves. They're basically dead and decaying material. A living mulch is something like a legume crop, like peas or beans, especially the bush varieties. A running crop like cucumbers or melons. It's a living plant that is planted densely enough or has a large enough leaf that it will actually form a mulch over the garden as it's growing. And then at the end of its growth period, you can chop them and leave them in place so that they become a decaying mulch afterwards. That was actually a very good question.
Right. Are there any plants that you wouldn't leave the roots in the soil?
Not from a physiological standpoint. Pretty much any plant could be, any root can be left in the soil to decay. The times that I would work to pull them out is if my next crop in my rotation was if that plant was an antagonist to that. So I would pull it out then for sure. And then once you replenish with your fresh compost and your dried molasses, you kind of remove that potential. But from a physiological standpoint, one of the regenerative gardening practices is generally to leave those roots in the soil until they decay naturally, because they have that much benefit in the soil. The only other time is if something's just in your way. We have some long-term crops like okra. If okra is happy in your garden, it's going to form a trunk, and they're hard to remove in the first place. So I just use a Japanese pruning saw and cut that okra back as low as I can and just let it decay in the soil. But there's no physiological reason that you can't leave the roots.
And then someone had a question about how to get educational credits from this class.
I think the very best, I think that a lot of urban harvest classes do qualify for your CE hours. So talk to your, if it's for a extension agent, you know, if it's for your master gardener CE, I think that you can contact them and get approval for that. They generally will approve an urban harvest class. If it's for a you know, for another group, I'm not sure how you would probably have to pre-qualify CE for something else, but I do believe that your extension agent will give you your CE for urban harvest classes.
And we have a question, what kind of slow release fertilizer to use if your bed garden has phosphorus buildup?
Yeah, and as known by a soil test. Claudia, this is a loaded question, so I'm going to give you the best answer, most honest answer I can. In general, we are finding over the last more than a decade that the basic soil test done by the A&M soil lab is going to come back with high phosphorus anytime you're using compost in your garden on a regular basis. However, that phosphorus is not detrimental to your plants, and there's been a lot of there have been several soil scientists in our area challenge A&M on this. One of the reasons that soil test comes back like that is because they do process a high volume of soil tests very inexpensively. And to pull that off, they have to use a series of very aggressive acids to break down these different nutrients in their soil test. That often results in that high phosphorus report coming back. But I in general don't worry about that anymore. When I very first saw it popping up, I was concerned about it. I did talk to a local soil scientist. He basically said, don't worry about it. It's not that accurate report coming back. It as a result of the aggressive acids that they use. That compost is, you know, we should continue to use it on a regular basis. And as long as we pay attention to pH in our soil, that the phosphorus, plants are not going to uptake excess phosphorus. So that's the best answer. So I would continue to use our locally produced slow release organic fertilizers, things like Microlife, things like Arborgate's Food Complete, the Gardenville products coming out of the San Antonio area. You're safe to use all of those. You're in good shape.
Okay, let's see. How often do we need to apply the ocean harvest and the probiotics?
Actually, in the production garden, I recommend every 2 weeks. In the ornamental garden, once a month. Sharon is doing such a good job getting ahead of me. I just have to say that, mention that, getting ahead of me, answering these questions. I go, oh, she the answer. I'm going to expand on that, but I just have to kind of give her a heads up on that. She's doing a great job.
Great. Yes, very helpful. And that's that is the recording of the previous class still available if I didn't attend, but I don't know.
That I don't know. We'd have to ask Urban Harvest about that.
What are your thoughts on cover crop? Oh, with like buckwheat and sun hemp?
Okay. Both of those are good quality cover crops. Size is going to be the only issue here. So let's say this, if you are using a cover crop between your other crops, that you're going to give an off season to growing buckwheat or rye or sun hemp, I would say yes, those do a very good job. You know, hemp is a accumulator, so that's very, very good for improving soil quality. Both of them have a lot of just biomass. But as far as blending in an intercropping situation or something like that, that might not be as good. You might be better off using a mix. And you can basically cover crop with your leftover seed. That's a very good way to use up leftover seed, especially if you're not 100% sure about viability, but you think it might be okay, is just, combine your leftover seed in a Ziploc bag and then, broadcast that around your primary crops to use as a cover crop. But if you have the luxury of giving up a season, or you want to grow, the buckwheat and sun hemp in between, from one season to another, that those are good quality. Definitely with the idea of accumulators and biomass for sure.
Any recommendations for an apartment grower? I have a balcony and indoor space.
Let's see here. Yeah, I think that indoor space is going to be the most difficult, mostly because of managing soil moisture very well. Indoor plants have a tendency to hold moisture longer because of the temperatures. Lighting is always an issue. You can provide grow light, but it needs to have the full spectrum of both blue and red spectrum lights. I know I use those, so I know that you can get them on Amazon and they're not terribly expensive. But indoor is a little bit more of a struggle. There really isn't any one window location that is sufficient to keep plants really super healthy. As far as your balcony is concerned, depending on your sun exposure, I would say that you can grow virtually almost anything in a container. Because of the fact that you have limited space, I wouldn't recommend exploring with things like, okra or corn, all of which can be grown in containers, but they're not, from a production standpoint, they're not efficient. I would definitely say they're things like leafy greens, things like pepper plants, tomatoes, those can all be grown on a balcony in large containers. Large plastic containers are not dreadfully expensive. Do pay attention to your, to weight. But I think, I wish somebody would actually put out a publication on growing for apartment dwellers or condo dwellers, because there are a great many things that you can grow in large containers. Just remember this, that because of the more frequent watering and the fact that they don't have the surrounding native soil available for minerals, that you may have to fertilize more often. It may be that you fertilize with every watering. You'll just have to kind of watch that, but really, really pay a lot of attention to nutrients. You can also mulch your containers. You can grow living mulches in your containers. And you definitely want to replenish the compost in them between every planting. Okay, I see the question about microlife coming in many types. Basically, you can keep it simple and either use microlife basic, which is the 624, I think, or use microlife ultimate, which raises your, it has a mineral package in it, first of all, and it's 8 something something. I can't remember the other two, but it has a mineral package in it and has a little bit higher nitrogen. But both of the standard, either microlife or microlife ultimate, just keep it simple. That's generally good for pretty much everything in the garden. Again, kudos to Sharon. She could just sit there and answer all the questions. She stayed ahead of almost all of them. Oh, good. Okay, does anyone else have a question? Or if you need to, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay, so then I would like to say thank you very much for spending Saturday with us. We know that it's precious time that should be available for your family and your hobbies and your activities. So thank you so much.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, this is Sharon here. I would just like to say thank you to both Angela and Susan for another year of classes with Urban Harvest and the Museum of Natural Science. They are an amazing pair, and Angela is a spectacular educator. Please continue to seek out her classes.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And it has been such a pleasure working with a avid gardener and just, somebody that absorbs education and promotes education. It's been just absolutely, it has been a great year, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. So I would like to thank you very, very much for that. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful Saturday, and we'll see you in 2025. Merry Christmas, happy holidays. Looking forward to seeing you next class.
Merry Christmas to all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.